Hello and welcome to Gameplaycasts. This video is another straight off the top of my pile of shame. What model is in my crosshairs this week? Well, it's the Librarian in Terminator armour from the Leviathan Box. Time to channel that warp energy into something constructive. The first thing is to decide how Dark Angels I wanted to make this guy. I'm a sucker for trying to make things lore accurate, so as per the codex astarties, this guy has kinda got to be that traditional dark blue of the librarians. The new mould also now has circular spots on the right pauldron and the left kneecap to add your chapter specific iconography. So clearly I'll be hitting this up with some winged swords. I'm also going to paint the whole of both pauldrons Dark Angels green. Here's the twist too. I'm going to replace the axe, as axes are more space wolves than Dark Angels. Plus the knights use mauls of absolution, so I'm going to use the cut off maul head from my Lunar Wolves Horus model and kind of superimpose that in here instead of the axe head. I've also seen some people add some really awesome looking arcs of energy using wire. I also want to make a magic shine effect on the runes and armour too, and as if that wasn't enough, I want to make this guy extra Dark Angels and I want to add some ropes to boot. So plenty to be getting on with in this project. I went in first using some paper clips, created some arcs of energy. I did this by straightening them out and then bending them using some pliers. As you can see by the video, originally I was going to stick with the axe, but as mentioned previously, I decided it had to go and I would use Horus's mace, or what was left of it. At the same time, I wanted to keep the runic pack on its back too, so I had to cut that off and clean it up to be stuck on top of the ropes once I'd made them. I then fitted the mace using my hobby drill, as well as some more paperclip cuttings to pin the joints to add some rigidity. The mace head is actually resin, so it's a bit of a pain to work with. Technically, I also combined a section from a mace of absolution from the Deathwing Knights with the top of Horus's mace. This was so I got the little power cable detail in. It was then time for the mace, so first I recovered the green stuff from the freezer. This is the stuff I used for my Sidonian Scatros, but it's a bust. It had already set, so I think green stuff in the freezer is only useful for a few hours / overnight. Due to the difficulties I've had in some of my previous videos, for this model I decided to use a mix that the guys on Tabletop Time seem to use, which is 50% milliput, 50% green stuff. So milli green, I don't know, milli stuff. I then deployed some Vaseline to my worktop and got to modelling the 3 sections of my ropes. All in all, this wasn't the worst thing in the world, and the combination definitely makes modelling and shaping a lot easier. I think a better ratio is probably more like 60-40 green stuff to milliput. So I'll give that a go next time. Anyway, eventually after a couple of do-overs, I had my finished Dark Angels Librarian. I undercut the modified sections by hand with some Abaddon black, and then went in with a white Scars dry brush to get it ready to base coat. As always, I went in first with some Black Templar contrast for all the armour joints and vents, then used Ultramarines blue contrast as the main base colour. I based the robes in Wraithbone before adding in Dark Angels green contrast on the underside of the robes and the 2 pauldrons. I then went round and coloured all of the papers in White Scar and added the wires in Uriel Yellow and Warpstone Glow. It was then time to add in the gold and silver metallics. I used Retributor Gold as always for all the skulls and details like the Iron Halo and the Librarian Medallion, then Lead Belcher for the Boulder and Mace. I added the classic red weapon casing synonymous with the Dark Angels using Flesh Terror's red contrast. I also added this to his mace hilt and picked out a few other details like the power wire. After this, I picked out the leather details and strapping using Wildwood contrast. Just a note on the Wildwood, I prefer this for leather because on top of a zenithal / white primed area, It adds all the depth you need in a single coat. I find that snakebite leather, while it looks great, needs multiple coats to look right, so I'm just using wildwood for speed. The final base coats were then some Gilliman's flesh for his face, and some Bracknell burgundy for the wax of the purity seals. It was then time for the washes. First up, I added some skeleton heart to the robes, then some Agrax Earthshade to all the oath papers to give it a more aged paper look. The trick here is to kind of allow it to pool in the recesses and try to keep the white in the highlighted areas. I used Seraphim Sepia on the yellow cables as well to give a more deeper golden yellow finish. At this point I waited for the model to dry. Once it was, I then added several coats of Nullnoil all over the blue and green armour, as well as the underside of the robes, and kinda anywhere where I thought it was a deeper shadow. This was to bring the blue down to a much darker blue than what you would see on an ultramarine. In hindsight, I think a 50-50 mix of Black Templar and ultramarine blue contrasts might have been a better strategy. I'd try this next time. I then added highlights to the robes using the original Wraithbone base colour. Here I did faff about quite a lot trying to get smooth transitions. I think there were two factors that made this more difficult than other models. The first was a slight texture from the new modelling mix, sort of like a furriness that seemed to make blending just a little bit rough. And the second was not waiting for each layer to fully dry, as the colours seem to blend better once they've fully cured. Lesson learned here, be patient. Or at least use a hairdryer or something.
Heresy grows from idleness.
After this, I added some edge highlighting to all of the details and areas in the light. This included some Caliban green on the pauldrons, shining gold to the gold details, Stormwolf silver on the silver, and Screamer pink on the purity seals. I used the standard ultramarine highlights on the blue, these being Macragge and Calgar blue, with the highest being Fenrisian grey. Here I also deployed a brush that I've adapted for stippling, and stippled on some lighter areas in the green and blue armour. I put these only in areas that would be catching the direct sunlight. I then did some edge highlighting, finishing with some spot white highlights to bring the contrast up to the max and make it pop. In the end, I did feel that there were a few areas I felt I'd over highlighted, particularly with the stippling, so I went back in with the ultramarines contrast to bring them back down. Once I was done here, it was time for the runes. So the first step is to add some Thousand Suns blue to all the power nodes on the armour and to the edges on either side of the runes and the markings on the armour. This doesn't have to be super neat, and a little bit of overrun can actually work for the glow effect. Just take your time. The last bit to do here was to colour most of the palm and the inside fingers of the outstretched hands, as well as in and around his eyes. We're trying to go for a glow effect in his eyes too. Once that's dry, get some Araman blue and repeat the same process as above. Except this time, we want to focus on getting the paint in the actual recess of the runes and armour lines. For the nodes, eyes and palms, focus on the inner, say 70%. A tip for the runes and the lines is to water down the paint and then use a very fine brush tip and just let it flow into the recesses as you move your brush around. This is actually a lot easier than it sounds if you get the mix right. And honestly, the best thing to do is just do a bit of practice, have a bit of kitchen roll standing by, and get your eye in before you go to town on the model. The last step is to take some Baharoth blue to add some spot highlights, say around 30% of the area, to all of the nodes, his eyes, and then finally to the centre of all the runes and armour lines. Oh, and don't forget to add some edge highlighting to the inner parts of his fingers and the palm of his outstretched hand. Initially I stopped here with my shine as I'd ordered some fluorescent paint, so while I was waiting I added the Dark Angels decals and tidied a few bits up. Now when the paint finally arrived, I'll be honest, the white/colourless one didn't really add anything to the model, and even the dark blue was not as much of a pop as I'd hoped. Yeah, all the runes actually glow in the dark now, but the fluorescent paint didn't make the shine effect pop like I'd hoped. I think the oil paint method is the best, and I'll try this next time. Here, and helpfully I lost the footage, or just didn't bother recording it, I used watered down white paint and watered down dark blue fluorescent. I then intermittently dripped this into the lines and runes to try and create the impression of the shine kind of rippling or moving. I think it really do come out nice in the end, but there were a few runes that I lost a bit of definition on, due to the 2 to 3 null coats I used to bring the armour shade down. Finally, I was ready to add in my arcing energy. I'd pre-drilled some holes, so I fitted them and superglued them in. I then base coated them in black and went in with the Vallejo thick mud on the actual base. I even added a little splash crater where one of the arcs touched the ground. I then tried to add a glow effect similar to the runes. Initially I tried to colour them dark on top of each bend and lighter on the bottom. The result was pretty rubbish. Instead, I opted for white at any contact point and then a gradient blue with the darkest in the middle, working back to white. This looked much better, and after adding a few leaves, the mandatory black trim and a few layers of varnish, the model was done. Boom. And there we have it, one Dark Angels Librarian in Terminator armour. Just under a year or so overdue. Overall I think the mini turned out pretty great. I was a bit nervous of the mix of blue and green for the main armour, but I stuck with it, and it actually came together. As I mentioned earlier, the 3 to 4 null coats definitely blurred some of the runes and line details on the armour, but I managed to work around this. If I was to do this again, I'd just mix some Black Templar into my Ultramarines blue. I think the only other thing is the thickness of the wire for the power arcs. Paper clips are just that bit too thick. Definitely cheap and easy to find, but I did order some 0.5mm brass wire for future projects, and this looks like the right kind of size. In this instance, I don't mind it too much. I'm going to say it's the power crackle combined with his psychic powers, the two amplifying when combined. Sounds logical enough to me. But yeah, all in all, another mini added to my Dark Angels 10th edition army. Let me know what you think of my new librarian in the comments below, as well as what the next project from your pile of shame is going to be. And that is all you get. Thanks for watching, and as always, f*** Erebus.